Hello everyone. Today's video is going to be a bit different in that it's more of a podcasty style of video. There's no real visuals to this since I'm just going to be talking about a topic which I think is important, so feel free to listen to this while you do something else, like cleaning your room. There are some sources which I've used and are linked in the description. The topic of today's video is about unions. What they are, why do we need them, and importantly, what are the ways that you can join or start a union. Part 0. McBurger Monarch. I want you to imagine an independently created burger restaurant, McBurger Monarch, which employs about 20 people to work in it. A few of these people are managers of some kind or the other, a few are administrative helpers, but the majority of the people in the store are some kind of manual laborer. They might man a till, or cook the burgers, or mop the floors. We'll call these people wage workers because they typically earn a wage based on the number of hours they work in the restaurant, and unfortunately, this amount is typically quite low. The way McBurger Monarch is structured is that these wage workers get very little of the money that McBurger Monarch generates. The manager is paid a lot more than the fry cook, and they certainly have a lot more power than any of the other workers. The manager or managers set the schedules, they decide what's on the menu, what the prices are, and so on. Some of them might have professional training, whilst others might have helped found the restaurant when it first opened. The catch, though, is that without people to man the tills, cook the burgers, and hopefully wash the floors, the restaurant can't actually function. It can't actually produce food and sell that food and therefore make any money. The managers certainly can't operate a restaurant of this size on their own. They need a workforce. But they also want the restaurant to make as much money as it can. After all, if the restaurant runs at a loss, it will go out of business. Now, the equation of profit is a simple one. Profit equals income minus expenses. I'll say that again. The profit you make is the income you get minus the expenses you had to produce your good or service. There are only two ways to make the profit go up. You can increase your incomes or you can reduce your expenses. I'm sure you can see that if you're the manager of McBurger Monarch, you really want to be doing both. But how do you do that? Well, there are plenty of restaurants in the city that you'd have to compete with to get the money of hungry people. It's quite an expensive process to compete. There is all kinds of costs and uncertainties involved in competition, and importantly, the potential for huge failures. There certainly would be egg on the owners of McBurger Monarch if they spent a bunch of money on advertising, opening more stores, and so on, and they didn't really see a massive increase in revenue. However, there is another side, and that's reducing expenses. In our restaurant, we can imagine that this means reducing the quality of the ingredients, going for powdered milkshakes instead of made from scratch ones, lower quality meat for the burgers instead of higher quality cuts, and especially in our case, trying to pay your employees as little as possible, while at the same time trying to get as much labor from them as possible. But wait, you must say, why would McBurger Monarch behave in this way? Surely, if the quality of the food drops, people are going to stop going to McBurger Monarch, and they'll lose money for sure. Well, this isn't quite true in practice, though it certainly does make a little bit of sense in theory. There are many reasons why the business can behave like this, and many reasons why it would choose to. McBurger Monarch might just be too conveniently situated for the bulk of its consumers to go elsewhere. They could use a number of cheaper chemical methods, like sugars and additives, to get the food to seem better than it actually is. Maybe they might lose a few customers, but if the great bulk of them stay, then they'll make a greater percentage of profit on those than they used to, and that's enough to justify the move. Also, remember that if they're paying less for ingredients, they can do something to lower the price of the food, and that might entice more people anyway, since people with little money would rather have some food, even if it is rubbish, over nothing at all. But let's turn our attention to the wage workers. Anyone will tell you that labor is one of the most fundamentally important part of expenses. The wage workers of McBurger Monarch are very lowly paid. They are in fact paid the exact minimum of what the law allows them to be paid. The justification for this is, of course, that these people are quote-unquote low skill, but I reject this idea. Working multiple-hour shifts, dealing with customers, risking your own bodily safety with machinery and processes, this doesn't sound like low-skill work to me, and if you ask someone who's actually worked in one of these places, the experience is deeply unpleasant, almost dehumanizing in a way. The myth that these people are just young kids who need pocket money or supplementary income while studying for quote-unquote better careers is just that, a myth. A great bulk of the workers in this industry are doing this for life. This is their job. There's no greener pasture for them. For the wage workers of McBurger Monarch, their only shot at making more money is to be promoted to a handful of managerial jobs, if and only if one of the existing managers leaves. You should be able to see that the majority of them will be stuck in their positions for their working lives. It feels awful just talking about it, and yet it's a daily reality, not just for our imaginary McBurger Monarch, but also for millions of people in similar industries like retail, hospitality, and so on. So the question is, what can be done about it? Well, in the long term, the answer is probably socialism. But actually, the question right now is what can be done in the short term? Well, that's where a union comes in. Part 1. What is a union? So let's get back to our wage workers at McBurger Monarch. If, say one of these, let's call him Bob, went to management and said, "Hey, I'd like a raise, please. I work hard, so give me more money." I think most of us would believe they'd be rejected, perhaps on the spot. You see, Bob's labor is necessary to run McBurger Monarch, but importantly, Bob himself isn't. If Bob gets hurt or fired, there's very many other desperate people who could be looking to replace him. Bob mans the tills and cleans the floors, right? Anyone can be taught how to do that job, right? So while Bob works hard and takes pride in his work, he's ultimately disposable in relation to it. You can repeat this for all of the other wage workers. What this demonstrates is that as individuals, each of the workers has very little ability to influence the decisions of upper management, because they are, individually, very replaceable. And of course, management is very quick to remind them of this fact. And yet, these workers are still suffering. The money they get in wages gets less valuable to them over time as inflation goes up, but their wages never do. So something that they can do about this is form a union. A union is, at its heart, an organization of workers in a business or industry that deals with management or industry leaders as a collective group rather than an individual one. Remember how Bob is powerless alone to really ask for anything? Well, if all of the wage workers in McBurger Monarch came together and decided to go on strike, McBurger Monarch would not actually be able to operate. Who is going to man the grills, the tills, and the cleaning? The managers? There's definitely not enough of them, and I believe many of them would find the work beneath them. The union is the gathering of all of the labor power of all of these individual workers into a mass that actually has the power to force the management to listen. If the workers are in a union, then they can decide together to go on strike, and if they do, they can close down the restaurant until their demands are met. Unions vary quite tremendously in size. There are some unions that are only for a single store or department, while other unions can grow to encompass millions of workers across several industries. The general rule of thumb about a union is that the larger the union is, the more effective it will actually be, since it can organize more and more of the workforce against the capital class. Before I go on, I'd like to introduce a term called PMC. Now, I don't mean private military contractor, although these people are certainly cold-blooded. In this context, PMC means professional managerial class. The managers of McBurger Monarch, our independent store, are the owners of the store, or at least employed to manage it on the behalf of the owners. The PMC are a group of people whose job it is to manage businesses on the behalf of the capitalist class. However, while they are workers, their interests are actually with the capitalists. These people always suck up to the bosses, so to speak. Part 2. Why join a union? Well, you might be asking, this is all well and good, but what can a union actually do for me? Well, I'm glad you asked. In McBurger Monarch, if the wage workers formed into a union, they have the power to demand pay increases or changes to the working hours, or more commonly, improvements to the safety conditions of their workplace. A great deal of union activity is done not because people want more money, but because capitalist businesses usually put profit over human life, and operate unsafe or near unsafe working conditions as a way to increase profits. Joining a union is in your interest as a worker because without one, you have very little recourse to get anything done in the workplace. Let's just say somehow you were able to have some influence as an individual to management. If you got a raise, it would likely only lead to resentment from the other workers. Some of them, in fact many of them, might feel that they're working just as hard as you, but they didn't get any raises and will resent you for it. What would that do? It would only drive you from them, and make it harder to come together as a workforce, just as management intends. What about safety improvements? You can't just get safety improvements for yourself. The safety improvements have to be useful to everyone. Protecting individuals instead of protecting the environment is far less effective. The managers want you as a worker to be as disinterested and resentful of your coworkers as you can be. They'd rather have you be less productive from being atomized and resentful than more productive as a united front, because that would be likely united against them. Part 3. The Pitfalls of Unions. Of course, that isn't to say that unions are perfect. For many of you, the experience that you have over a union is paying a little of your salary or wage to a group of people that don't really seem to do much of anything for you. You see, it's entirely possible for a union to be done badly and for it to actually work against the interests of its workers. Remember the PMC I mentioned earlier? Well, if your union is run by a professional manager and not by a worker that you elected or chose, then it's very likely that this manager, whose class interest is with their boss, is not actually going to act in your interest as a worker. The bad unions I talked about earlier, many of them are what we call company unions. That is, they are not actually unions. I need to stress this. If a union is made by, supported by, or even controlled by the company, it is not an actual union. The company will never let the union do anything that works against the interest of the bosses, even if it is in the interests of the business. So company unions are a great way of pacifying the workforce and turning them against the idea of unionization. Your unions must always be by the workers, for the workers. Anything else is not going to get you anywhere, since class interests tend to override most other concerns. Of course, forming a union can be very difficult. In many countries, unions are problematic to form because of legislation. If you're wondering why that is, it's because capitalists pay politicians to pass laws that makes forming unions difficult or burdensome. It's, after all, in their class interest. But more so, lots of workplaces are really anti-union. Because unions are pro-worker and anti-capitalist, it's in their nature to be in opposition. So forming a union, joining a proper one, these are things that can get you in trouble or even fired, and so it comes at a risk to you as an individual. This is all the more reminder that being individuals without collective bargaining power is only to our detriment. But it is definitely a real problem that hinders a lot of union development. Lastly, many businesses will outright engage in union busting, where they will either get police or private forces to come and forcibly break up a strike or union action, oftentimes violently, or they will get scabs. A scab is a person who is brought in either from outside the union or another workplace to continue the work while the union is going on strike. So imagine if you did manage to organize a strike and stop working. If your bosses can find other workers, scabs, they can get those workers into the business, often with the help of the police, and operate the business. And there we have an effective way of stopping your strike. The scabs will keep the business open, and now your union workers are just missing out on pay without being able to force the bosses to give in to their demands because they aren't hurting the profit of the business. This is why huge unions are more effective than small ones. If all the steel workers, say, are in a union, then the bosses can't get scabs to replace the striking workers because all of the available labor is already on strike. Despite these risks, though, a union is still one of the best ways to effect immediate change to your working environment and advocate for your rights as a worker. The bosses you work for ultimately view you as disposable labor. A union lets you challenge this idea by showing them that in fact, it's the workers who produce the value of the business, not the people who just merely own it. Part 4. Joining or forming a union. So now, hopefully, I've made the case that even though there might be some problems, joining or forming a union is a great thing to do, especially if you're suffering as a worker. Even if you aren't, a union will only make your position as a worker more secure in the future. So now we get to the part of how you can actually join or make one. Well, unfortunately, the answer is rather variable. Different countries have different labor laws regarding unionization, as well as different conditions of a labor movement that might help or hinder unionization. The first port of call for you might be the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. They're an international labor union that's generally speaking available in several countries. It's also a radically socialist union, so they're not going to be an easy pushover like, say, a company union. In fact, they're advocating for one big world union to usher in a socialist revolution. I've included a link to them in the description. Look them up to see if they have a branch that you can join, or possibly help you create a branch of theirs in your country. In South Africa, one of our big unions is NUMSA. which is the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa. They're also in the description. They're closely aligned to one of the socialist parties in our country, so if you are in that industry, I would definitely recommend joining them if you haven't already. But of course, if you can't join a union because, say, you're not in the industry they represent or there are no unions available to you, then you might want to consider starting one. Depending on the local laws, this may or may not, strictly speaking, be legal. But then again, it is legal for people to pay starvation wages, so the law isn't a good arbitrator of morality. I don't suggest that you break the law, nudge nudge wink wink, but if you are looking to start a union, here are some of the steps that you should consider. Firstly, you have to talk to your co-workers. You have to do this outside of the business and away from the bosses. You have to talk to them about the problems they're experiencing, and you have to be able to bring up that the solutions to these problems require everyone to participate. Wage increases, safety equipment, working hours, etc. This is to convince them to form into a union, either joining one or filing the paperwork to form one, if the laws allow. However, if there are no laws that support you, then even an informal union can be very effective if the members are committed. Once you've done this, you need to figure out your demands. What do you want the management to do? And think about it very carefully, because once you issue the demands, the antagonism will begin. If the management refuses to comply, then your option will be to go on strike. Even a threat of a strike might be enough to swing them in your favor, but if it isn't, you'll have to prepare for a strike. So this will take time, so your members will need to gather money, either from the community or from each other, so that they can support each other and go on strike. At the same time, you should be trying to drum up support from the community. Lots of businesses, social media, and other factors might be potentially in your favor if you're trying to convince people to stop supporting a business while you're on strike. It's even better if you can form a union with multiple related companies or businesses. This will help prevent scabs from stopping your labor action. If you can't join or form a union, then what you can do is spread union awareness to other workers and support union strikes by sharing their struggles. The bosses want the public to think that union strikes are because workers are greedy, but this isn't the case. More often than not, they're striking for basic needs, for basic survival. Spread the truth to the people whoever you can, and wherever you can. And lastly, never cross a picket line. If there's one piece of advice I hope that you take away from this, it's to never cross a picket line of striking workers. Stand in solidarity with people striking and stand in solidarity with the workers. Remember, everyone, we're all in this together.